I'm Josh Greenberg. I'm a program director at the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. We are a 92-year-old private philanthropic foundation in the United States, which means it's interesting times for us. What I want to do is just spend a couple minutes talking about, you saw our logo on the slide earlier today. Over the course of the day, you'll probably hear Sloan come up again. We're kind of like very deeply invested in this area, and I wanted to give you a couple minutes of framing about why, from our perspective, this is important. So the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, I'm reading our mission from the website, makes grants primarily to support original research and education related to science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and economics. The foundation believes that these fields and the scholars and practitioners who work in them are chief drivers of health and prosperity. So that's where we start from. We are a basic science research funder primarily. Most of our budget goes towards question-driven research. We have a public understanding of science program. We have a higher ed program that thinks about who is doing that work. And we have a technology program, which I work on, which my colleague Devora, who's here, works on, and our colleague Sonali. It's the three of us. And the technology program was somewhat anomalous among basic research funders. It was built to leverage advances in technology to benefit the research community. We're not looking at any one particular discipline. We're interested in how emerging technology or technology more generally supports science broadly. Right now, we have three main areas of focus. One, thinking about AI and science, like kind of everybody. One, thinking about the role of collaboration, the role of technology in collaboration. We know how to have meetings like this because we can haul all our bodies physically here. If this were remote or virtual, we'd be constrained in certain ways, and we're really interested in how to expand that possibility set. And really, the core area of focus for us over the past handful of years has been a framing around open source. 5 years ago, when we revised our framing and website, we put that XKCD comic on our as the sort of splash graphic on our page. That seemed like novel and sent a really strong signal at the time. It still is the best encapsulation of why we're doing what we're doing, and I think it's become much more sort of like dominant and mainstream. So. I'll start with a statement. From my perspective, I see open as a means to an end, which is maximizing how much new scientific knowledge humanity produces and shares. If the best way to do that were a single organization or firm doing all research internally and then just producing public good outputs, I'd be behind it. That's just not how the world works. Science is the most ambitious, large-scale, distributed collaboration in human history. Isaac Newton famously talked about standing on the shoulders of giants. But what makes science really work today is that anyone can stand on the shoulders of anyone who's come before and everyone else who's working right now. From a Sloan perspective, that's why open is a means, not an end. Openness is how we facilitate, structure, and scale that collaboration. It's how we make a massively distributed enterprise function at all. And it's also why I fundamentally think about open, and maybe it's lowercase, open source, as a noun, not as a noun or as an adjective, but as a verb. It's not about a single license choice or a decision made at the end of a project. For us, it's a set of practices, how work is structured, how contributions are invited, how decisions are made, how credit is assigned, how disagreements are resolved, and how knowledge is maintained over time. It's about front-loading these decisions to lower marginal costs of new contribution. In that sense, open source is really a theory of collaboration, in our case, particularly focusing on scientific or research collaboration, made concrete. So that framing helps explain why Sloan has leaned so hard into open source software in recent years. It's not because we think software is uniquely important relative to data, articles, hardware, models, instruments, other kinds of research outputs. I would say that software was relatively overlooked in science for a long time. But the real reason for this focus is that open source software is the single best real-world instantiation we have of the norms, infrastructure, and practices that enable large-scale distributed collaboration. It's not perfect, but it works remarkably well. It encodes things like transparent contribution, modular work, versioning, attribution, peer review, and collective maintenance at global scale. These are all things that are essential to how we want the scientific enterprise to work. Our strategy has been to take those strengths seriously and ask how we can leverage them to improve how science itself is practiced. One big blocker is you don't have tooling and infrastructure to do the same kinds of rich practices around other kinds of research outputs that we do around software. I can't throw a pull request to a data set or file a ticket on an article. Because we don't have those affordances widely available, we've never been forced to have the governance conversations about how those various kinds of research products are to be used. So this really, really matters right now. We're at a moment where I would argue the dominant trends are moving towards enclosure rather than openness. Resources feel scarcer, institutions feel more fragile. Universities are under pressure and increasingly tempted to look inward, to treat knowledge, data, and technology as assets to be protected or monetized. At the national, at least I'll speak for the United States, but also at the global level, I think we're seeing movement away from cooperation and toward regional blocs, hegemonic competition, and great power tensions. All of that pushes against the idea that science is a shared global enterprise. And in that environment, openness becomes harder, but also more important. This isn't just about interfaces between the most powerful or best resourced institutions either. One of the deepest promises of openness is that it creates pathways in for anybody with the talent and desire to contribute. There are strong normative arguments for this, but even if you set those aside, there's a really simple, basic, pragmatic point, which is that we're facing challenges that are too large and too complex for any small slice of humanity to solve. It's an all-hands-on-deck situation. We cannot afford to leave talent on the table. Trying to identify all the right people, ideas, and approaches from the top down is simply inefficient. Open systems work precisely because they allow contribution to emerge from unexpected places. They let people self-select into problems where they can add value. They allow progress to come from outside the institutions that otherwise would have needed to be chosen in advance. So for us at Sloan, openness isn't about idealism, it's about capacity. It's about building a scientific enterprise that's adaptive, capable of absorbing contributions at the scale that the moment demands. So then the question is, how are we approaching this at Sloan? Really, we're deploying our resources in 4 kinds of ways. One is focused on tooling. We're interested in, there are certain things like the Journal of Open Scientific Software or dashboards like the stuff that Software Heritage is working on that will sort of enable more adoption of open source practices in the research enterprise. We, for a long time, have been really focused on training, particularly sort of non-curricular approaches like the carpentries or the work that PyOpenSci or rOpenSci are doing. We fund a lot of research, particularly these days, to surface requirements and track what's happening in a moment when generative AI is being adopted by, I mean, if you're a first-year student in a computational biology lab, the way you scale up your work looks fundamentally different now than it did 3 years ago, and now that we have generative AI tools. Finally, and most relevant to today, we explicitly think about funding institutional and bureaucratic innovation. 6 years ago, when we started making grants to support the establishment of OSPOs in universities, it was clear that at the time, nobody in a university, I'd argue this, please challenge me, but there's no obvious place in a university where responsibility for open source software or open source practices more generally sits. There are a number of interested and important organizational constituencies, the libraries, research community. We saw the list earlier today of all the places. And at different institutions, different of those stakeholders might raise their hand and say, we'll take the lead. But there was no obvious place, and there was no obvious way to talk about what it meant to put organizational heft behind those practices. So 6 years ago, from a philanthropic funding perspective, the best thing we could do was help de-risk that institutional experimentation and innovation. That's why we deployed a lot of resources. And we particularly did it in US institutions because those are the ones that we most understand. That it's local, but we understand the particular ways that economics, that money, and that incentives are configured. There are differences in how those play out between the states, between even different parts of Europe, between other parts of the world. So we started there, but it was never really about that particular piece. It was about sort of, from the beginning, we had an aim towards building a global community of people advancing these aims in their own local context, which is why the other thing we did was really thank God for Claire and Richard and Kara and others who really from the beginning started to build this as a community space. So now we have 6 years of documented patterns and shared knowledge from that community. And one of the most exciting, important things has been that that others have emerged, not just sort of joining, but even taking leadership positions. That community, there was a joke yesterday about how do we not keep going to Sloan for more money, and really the goal is to build a truly cross every possible boundary imaginable community. And really, that's where the future growth lies. From my perspective right now, the most important thing is to create spaces for exchange and support this community and its growth and expansion into different contexts going forward, which is, why we're here.